Noura Al Taqaqa was a well-known singer in Kuwait during the 1970s. Her voice was unparalleled, captivating audiences at weddings, festivals, and other celebrations. Noura's fame spread across the country, and she was frequently invited to perform at prestigious events. Her singing was not just a talent but a deep connection to her cultural roots, and it brought joy to many. One day, Noura received an invitation to sing at a wedding in a remote part of the Kuwaiti desert. The invitation was unusual, delivered by an elderly man who appeared at her door unexpectedly. He was dressed in traditional Kuwaiti attire, but there was something unsettling about him. His eyes were too dark, and his smile too wide. He introduced himself as an emissary for a wealthy family and explained that the wedding was to be a grand affair, held at an old, isolated mansion deep in the desert. The payment he offered was substantial, enough to tempt Noura despite her unease. Noura agreed, though the old man's presence left her with a lingering sense of dread. She was told that she would be picked up at dusk and taken to the wedding. The man bowed and left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Noura to prepare for the evening. That evening, just as the sun was setting, a sleek black car pulled up outside Noura's home. The driver, a young man with a blank expression, motioned for her to get in. Noura hesitated for a moment, the unease she had felt earlier returning with force. But the promise of a generous payment and her reputation as a singer pushed her forward. The car sped off into the desert, the sun quickly disappearing behind the dunes. The journey was long and silent, with the landscape growing more desolate as they traveled deeper into the desert. Noura noticed that the further they went, the colder it became, an unnatural chill settling in the air. After what felt like hours, they arrived at the mansion. It was an old, crumbling structure, unlike any she had seen before. The building seemed out of place, almost as if it had been forgotten by time, its walls covered in a strange, dark moss. The windows were black, revealing nothing of the interior. The driver motioned for Noura to enter, but said nothing. As she approached the heavy wooden doors, they creaked open on their own, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Noura felt a shiver run down her spine, but she pushed her fears aside and stepped inside. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet. The air was thick, and the dim light cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. Noura was led to a grand hall where the wedding was to take place. The guests were already assembled, all dressed in traditional Kuwaiti attire, but something was off. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes reflected the candlelight in an unnatural way. The bride and groom stood at the center of the room. The bride was beautiful, but her expression was devoid of emotion. The groom's face was hidden beneath a thick veil, his presence imposing yet unsettling. Noura took her place and began to sing, her voice echoing through the hall. As she sang, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. The guests remained silent, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, as Noura finished her first song, she noticed something strange. The guests were not moving. They were frozen in place, their eyes wide open, but their bodies unnaturally still. A cold wind blew through the hall, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. Suddenly, the bride and groom turned towards Noura, their faces now twisted and grotesque. The groom lifted his veil, revealing hollow, empty sockets where his eyes should have been. The bride's face contorted into a hideous grin, her teeth sharp and glistening in the dim light. Panic gripped Noura as she realized the truth: this was not a human wedding. She had been lured into a gathering of spirits, or perhaps something far worse. The guests, now revealing their true forms, began to close in on her, their distorted faces leering at her with malevolent glee. Noura's instinct for survival kicked in. She turned and ran, her voice choking in her throat as she fled through the dark, winding corridors of the mansion. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. She could hear the whispers of the spirits behind her, their laughter echoing through the halls. She reached the front door and flung it open, bolting out into the desert night. The car that had brought her was gone, leaving her alone in the vast, empty desert. Noura ran blindly into the night, the cold desert wind whipping against her face, her heart pounding in her chest. By the time she reached a nearby village, she was delirious with fear and exhaustion. The villagers found her the next morning, wandering aimlessly, her voice hoarse from screaming. She told them her story, but few believed her, dismissing it as the ravings of a woman who had spent too long in the desert. But those who knew of the old legends, the stories of spirits and jinn who held their gatherings in the forgotten corners of the desert, understood the truth. Noura had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, but she was never the same again. Her voice, once her most prized possession, was gone. She could no longer sing, her voice reduced to a faint whisper. Noura lived the rest of her days in fear, haunted by the memory of that night. The mansion was never found again, and the story of Noura Al Taqaqa became a warning, a tale to remind others of the dangers that lie in the unseen world. To this day, her story is told in hushed tones, a chilling reminder of what happens when one ventures too far into the unknown.